Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wednesdays at the Center. Today's talk is entitled, What Comes Next in Colombia's 5-Year Peace Process. We are very pleased to welcome Gabriella Levy and Mateo Villamizar-Chaparro, who are Ph.D. candidates in the Department of Political Science here at Duke University. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our own Dr. Miguel Rojas-Sotelo.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and welcome back. My name is Miguel Rojas-Sotelo from the Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. As you know, Colombia is in the middle of an electoral cycle, which successfully, but not without some challenges, completed the congressional and primary elections 2 weeks ago, with substantial changes in the conformation of the bicameral Senate. The country is now moving into full presidential mode. However, at the center of the political debate is still the peace accords, the peace process between the Colombian government and the Farc-EP signed back in 2016. The peace accords were established with the promise of truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. And within this framework, a special transitional justice system was formed and is enacting rulings with the objective of a possible closure, a path for reconciliation. This series of events under the banner 5Y of Peace, Colombia, look at some aspects of such transition from conflict to reconciliation. Post-conflict scenarios are not easy. We invite you to check the events and join the conversations. But today's event is a very special one. We have members of our own community presenting the topic. What comes next in the Colombian peace process? We know that it's framed within the fact that the FARC is no longer a U.S. terrorist group list. It's not in the list of terrorist groups. But Colombia's peace is far from secure, as our authors would affirm. Just to tell you, as today, 9 signatories of the peace accords have been murdered just in 2022, this year, 1 last week, reaching 308 since 2016, most of them former combatants from the FARC. Since September 2016, according to In the Past, 1,327 human rights and environmental leaders had been assassinated in Colombia, and 288 massacres had been committed. The peace agreement outlined plans to transform the FARC from an armed group into a peaceful political party, created transitional justice institutions to address wartime atrocities, and establish programs for rural development. 5 years later, Colombia has achieved several milestones in the FARC's reintegration into civil life, and there's less violence, that's true. But Colombia peace agreement still polarizes politicians and the public, and the implementation has been very slow. To discuss this and other issues with us today, we have Gabriella Levy, a political scientist from Columbia University and doctoral candidate in the political science department at Duke University, focusing on political violence, ranging from civilian targeting to vigilante punishment to targeted assassinations of civil society and social leaders. And Mateo Villamizar-Chaparro, economist and political scientist from Universidad de los Andes, Bogotá, Colombia, with masters in international affairs from UC San Diego and political science from Universidad de los Andes, and doctoral candidate at the Duke University's Department of Political Science, focusing on political economy. Thanks, Gabriella and Mateo, for accepting our invitation. They will be presenting some of the contents of the research that was partially published by the Washington Post back in December 2021 under the same title of this talk, What Comes Next for Colombia's Peace Process, that was co-written with his co-author Juan Telles, that is not joining us. Then the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here, and we'll be in the back ready for engaging conversation later.
All right, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I believe Mateo is going to share his screen Awesome. As you already heard, my name is Gabriella. You can call me Gabby. I'm here with my co-author, colleague, Mateo. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about Colombia's peace process, its strengths, its weaknesses, and what we see as what could happen in the future. So let's get started. I know that many of you may already know this. Mateo, if you want to switch slides. Many of you already know this, but let me briefly talk about what the peace accord is. So this was a 2016 agreement between the Colombian government and the Farc, which has historically been the largest leftist guerrilla group in the country. It's a super complex agreement. Some of the key provisions include, obviously, the transformation of the Farc from an armed group into a political party with guaranteed seats in Congress. Although the majority of Farc has laid down their arms, there are Farc dissidents who either chose not to disarm or have rearmed since the accord, as well as other guerrilla groups who weren't a part of the peace accord. The document also created a range of transitional justice institutions, which include trials for leaders, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also an organization to search for the disappeared or the missing. It also contained a wide range of provisions about rural reform. Something you might hear us talk about are PDET areas, and these are areas that the government has designated for additional economic development because of their history and their legacy of sort of being affected by the civil conflict. The accord also contained a lot of content about drugs, coca specifically, including the creation of the National Comprehensive Program for the substitution of crops used for illicit purposes. We're gonna talk about what has happened to the accord since, but of course, if you have any questions about what was in this accord, feel free to drop it in the chat. And I think Mateo's gonna take it for a bit.
Thank you, Gabby. So we first want to start after going through what the accords were, is like what has been going well. And one of the things that we want to highlight is that the levels of violence in Colombia have decreased a lot from the peak of the conflict in the early 2000s. Especially if we look in terms of the intentional homicides, we do see here data from the World Bank where we see that there has been a steady decline, especially since the 2000s, but also after the 2016 peace accord, where the number of people that have been killed in the country has decreased, and which is always great. And given that the peace process, one of the main goals is to remain peaceful, then this is like really important. The second thing is that the battle-related deaths between conflicts, either between combatants or combatants and civilians, have also decreased, especially and more abruptly since 2016. So overall, we do see that although some of these processes have started before 2016, after 2016, we do see that violence overall has been decreasing for the most part in the country. What other things have gone well? Well, there has been more than 13,000 individuals that have gone through the HEP, that is the organism in charge of reparations and sort of like the reconstructing what has happened with the Colombian conflict. This has been super important for both Colombians at every levels of the economic scale or whatever. In the sense that one of the good things about the HEP is that it has brought to attention people that were both victims from the conflict, victimizers, or something in between. There has been a lot of people with businesses in Colombia that were in the HEP, and they were like asking for reparations because they lived there, or family members of theirs have been kidnapped, have been killed. There has also been stories and recounts of how different processes and how different battles and massacres happen, where the people have been buried after these things happen. And all of these have been very useful in terms of just like identifying who the people that are guilty of certain events are, but also to identify the huge number of victims that have been affected by the Colombian conflict. The other important thing, and that has gone well as well, is that most former Farc fighters have also turned in their weapons, and the vast majority have not returned to fighting. Here we have some statistics from the ARN, that is the Agency of Reincorporation and Reintegration from Colombia. And we do see that after 2016, especially people from the Farc have been demobilizing and entering into the demobilization route very, very often. The big jump that we see there during the early 2000s, it is just the response of both ELN and FARC members. But also we do see that, you know, there's steady decline after 2016, which means that the small number of people that were in the FARC are just like coming into and reintegrating into civil society. What has gone a little bit less well? So in 2016, one of the first sort of like battles that the peace accord had to fight was that in 2016 there was a plebiscite that were looking for the support of the Colombian population towards accepting or not accepting the peace accords on themselves. This was a very, very like tight and very close competition. And in the elections, the vote for the no or not accepting what the peace accords were sustaining won by 50.2% of the vote. This was actually, the difference was very, very small, and it was about like 53,000 votes between yes and no. And this was one of the first things that put, you know, or challenged the peace accords. After this, like a lot of local politicians and national politicians started trying to change or to include certain things that were not initially included in the accords in order for it to pass through Congress. Here we do want to highlight two of our of the papers that our co-author, that is Mateo, wrote about this, because they're really tied on why do we think Colombians and particularly certain types of Colombians didn't accept the provisions or the resolutions that were in the accords. So in his 2021 paper, Juan shows that the result, using a conjoint experiment, he shows that individuals that are more conservative in their ideological scale, and they're like a little bit more of authoritarian tendencies in their worldviews about how things should be, have strong preferences for more punitive agreements than individuals who score lower on these qualities. What this means is that these individuals that have these more like strong and conservative authoritarian worldviews tended to want a more restrictive and a more punitive peace accords than the one the government actually put in forward. In the 2019 paper, Juan also says and looks at how citizens' responses to individual provisions are also driven by normative considerations. So here, like again, individuals will prefer agreements that punish actors that were perceived as perpetrators in the conflict and reward actors that were perceived as victims. So here, this whole discourse regarding around who's the victim and who's the perpetrator becomes very important, and it's actually related to how the individuals vote in the 2016 plebiscite. There are other things and some early challenges besides the vote that have also been affecting the peace accord. One of them is that there has been some executive delay for the implementation of the peace accords. There has been a delay in the rollout of assistance for coca substitution programs, and then those of you that were also seeing, that also watched the movie a couple of weeks ago from this seminar series, can also look at what happened there and what are the results of some of these things. But one of the main things here is that, you know, one of the sort of like strongholds of the peace accords was these rapid change and rapid investment in rural development, so that these coca growers would be allowed to substitute the coca crops for other types of crops. However, given that the rollout has been very low, people are still producing coca, and many other individuals started producing coca, given that the demand even increased. So if we look at the coca numbers right now and the number of hectares that have been cultivated with coca, it's actually increasing after the 2016 peace accords. We also see that there was some delay in some of the institutional features of the peace accord, especially in terms of the special districts. So in Colombia, during the peace accords, there were created 16 special districts that the idea was give people and victims living in these municipalities the chance to select someone into Congress. These should have been implemented in the 2018 elections, but given the delay of the government, the first time that they were put into function were like this past Sunday, where we had elections, and we can talk a little bit about the results later. There also was some budget cuts for the land restitution unit and the reintegration units coming from the executive government. So two of the more important institutions that were indicated with some of the most important pieces of the peace accord had some budget cuts, and that also delayed the amount of people and the amount of processes that they could do since 2016. The other important thing, and it's been an early challenge that has been complicated in itself, and this also relates to some of the things that Miguel was saying in the introduction, is that there's a rising insecurity in terms of in the country, and this has certain effects on turnout. So according to In the Past, that is a think tank in Colombia that looks at the levels of violence around the country, in 2021 there were 96 massacres that resulted in 338 victims. In 2020, 310 social leaders were killed, and 64 of them were ex-combatants. These figures have increased since then, to the point that like the number of massacres that had happened or leaders assassinated has become basically a regularity every week in Colombian media. With Gabi, we do look at what are the effects of these assassinations in terms of turnout and vote choice. We do see and we do find suggestive evidence that says that places that suffered any sort of violence for social leaders or for ex-combatants have a lower turnout. That means that people are going to vote in less quantity than in other districts. We also see that those who decide to vote in these places also have certain preferences for who to vote with, and they usually go with individuals that are a little bit more less supportive or these punitive and like warrior like políticas guerreristas, that are these sort of like more mano dura kind of policies in the country. These two things, both the delays and the rising insecurity, has led the Colombian Constitutional Court to demand the government to comply with the peace process and guarantee the safety for ex-combatants, which is something very important because now, you know, the independent judiciary system of Colombia, it's also pushing the government to actually comply with the accords. What are some of the ongoing challenges? Although some of the things that I mentioned that are still ongoing, we do feel that there are certain things that haven't been necessarily resolved. The first one is that there is a lot of discrimination and stigmatization of ex-combatants by local population and firms. In our ongoing project that I have with Juan, we went and did some focus groups with ex-combatants, and we were talking about how was reintegrating to social life and also reintegrating into the economic life as well. And I just want to, like looking at some of the results that we had from these conversations, I just want to bring like two excerpts of the interviews that we have for you, that both talk about the discrimination that these individuals have, either within their society or finding a job. So the first one says, y yo estaba ahí y pude observar la discriminación que hay para todos los reincorporados. Inclusive yo mismo, en carne propia, lo he vivido. Ahora en el presente de que es muy difícil que un empresario contrate un reincorporado. La palabra reincorporado para ellos les suena un veneno mortal. La palabra reincorporado a ellos piensan que uno es un bruto, un ignorante, un man que solo sabe dar es bala, porque eso es lo que se habla en los términos directos. Y tratar de darle trabajo a una persona mayor de 60 años, a ellos no les interesa la experiencia. Overall, here we do see that individuals that go through the reincorporation process don't really have a good time when they're hired. First, it's very hard for them to be hired. They do feel there's a stigma and a discrimination against them from like people who might hire them. And also one of the things is that there's gonna be a very differential treatment of who's being hired. Like a lot of the people from the Farc that have gone through the reintegration process are older people that have some experience, that have a lot of actually work experience in terms of like rural development, production of different crops, and these things are not necessarily very well accepted by certain certain firms and certain jobs, and that has been very difficult to handle. The National Reintegration Agency has a series of workshops and a series of policies that will help these individuals to get new skills, to be more attractive for firms outside of rural areas, but it's been a very, very hard thing to do. The other thing is that there are some Farc dissidences that are rearming, and this has ignited a larger conflict in certain areas of the country. Especially when we look at Arauca, we do see that individuals here are like starting in a war zone where like some of these Farc dissidences are starting here and starting to increase the levels of violence in a regional scale. We also see that there are new armed actors taking advantage of the power vacuum left by the Farc. So we do see new criminal groups that are starting to take advantage of these like vacuums or like the new reintegration process of the Farc to just take into account or just like take into their own hands the production of coca from the region, or just take into their own, just control certain drug trafficking areas and routes from the places that the Farc was stronger before. Lastly, we do see that there has been some displacement increasing. In 2021 and since 2016, we've seen that 500 families have had to move after their courts were signed into more urban areas, precisely because some of this violence that is ongoing around the country has led them to displace themselves, which goes back to the early 2000s, where we have similar movements around the country.
All right, so turning now towards the future, 2022 is an election year in Colombia. There were just some regional and local elections and some very preliminary presidential elections a few weeks ago. And then the next two rounds of the presidential election, or one if someone gets a majority, those are coming later in the year. And I think that we have sort of two key worries going into these elections. As might have been clear from what Mateo was saying, a lot of the existing threats to the peace accord have come from the far right, which is currently in power. And so sort of a similar trend could lead to further erosion of the peace accord. While we can't obviously predict, there are sort of two ways that we might see this happen. So voters might not punish the far right, which has been in power, for its ongoing violence or its slow implementation of the peace accord. I was a little bit more worried about this prior to the elections last week, where the conservatives didn't do nearly as well as the left. I have some research in the Journal of Politics that shows that voters are sometimes willing to support candidates, even when those candidates are tied to wartime civilian victimization. For example, they're more willing to support candidates who have a more sort of loose tie to the violence. So they weren't necessarily the people on the ground committing it, but they may have ordered it. So in other words, this means that high-ranking officials may be able to plausibly deny their involvement and remain in power, while a lot of the candidates historically haven't been sort of accused war criminals. There remain ties between individuals who were in power during sort of atrocities and who are, running for office today. And obviously the Farc has very clearly acknowledged its role in a lot of abuses, and they have 10 seats in Congress. It may particularly be the case that voters continue not to support the left and continue to support far-right figures who maybe aren't promoting the safety of the demobilized combatants, because they do see guerrillas as the largest threat to their security. Only about 6% of the country's population indicate that they support the Farc. Although, of course, we don't know the reliability of that number because people might not be willing to indicate their support. So those are sort of some of our thoughts about what might happen. Now let's talk a little bit about what happened in the most recent elections. So just for some context, the elections a few weeks ago were sort of like primaries. So Colombian politicians can create whatever coalitions they want, and then they sort of run these internal elections within those coalitions. So sort of the three major coalitions on the left, Gustavo Petro won by a lot. He is a former M19 guerrilla, and he's an ex-mayor of Bogota. He's currently the front runner, and he's a pretty strong supporter of the peace accord. Sergio Fajardo, who won a lot fewer votes than the other two, is the ex-mayor of Medellin. He's also a supporter of the peace accord, and he rhetorically ties building peace to creating a depolarized country. He's very much a centrist, and sees people sort of on both sides as creating polarization, but also contributing to a form of instability, which is not just about peaceful politics. And on the right is Federico Ofico Gutierrez. He's also the ex-mayor of Medellin. He has taken sort of a similar approach to Duque, who's the current president. He says that he will comply with the accord, but then immediately goes on about how the FARC has done everything wrong and the FARC needs to comply as well. And this is linguistically sort of like saying that you'll do something, but sort of hinting that you're not a really strong supporter of the agreement. There's no way to know what he would actually do in terms of the peace accord if he were in office. But from what he said, he seems like he would continue Duque's pattern of slow implementation that Mateo talked about. So now let's talk about the victim seats. Mateo, if you could switch the slides. So Mateo was talking about this a little bit, but in the accord, there were 16 seats accorded to victims who come from conflict areas. These seats were held up in some legal battles, but they were finally voted on. And there were some victims voted into office, that's true. But there are also some worrying results. For example, one winner is the son of a paramilitary leader named Jorge 40. And in addition, 6 other people there's been evidence of irregular campaign financing or ties to paramilitaries. And this ties back to sort of what I was talking about a minute ago, where people are willing to elect individuals with spotted histories, right? For various reasons, but even these seats that are supposed to go to victims aren't fully going to the people most affected by the conflict. So that is what we have for you today. We wanted to keep our presentation short. Mateo, if you could switch slides to our last one, because we wanted to hear what you think and answer your questions. We have here some topics to discuss if you guys don't have anything to say, but from the chat, it seems that you have lots to say. So we look forward to your questions and your comments. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, guys, Gabriella and Mateo, for this initial thoughts. And yes, we see that we have a very active conversation happening simultaneously in the chat. And I think that's precisely what we want to achieve in here. I do have many questions, but I just want to try to bring a couple of things that are going on in the back, because I think you can help us to sort some of these questions. The first question is about what is the FARC in this agreement? What the FARC has to do, right? And I think this is one of the big misconceptions in general. When you sign an agreement, the agreement put both parts together, right, into agreement, and both parts agree on things. That's not that one part do one thing and the other part will do the other. But if you want to just make a comment about what the FARC had to do in order to be compliant with the accord.
Yeah, so I can jump in, and then I'm sure I'll forget stuff and Mateo can add. I think that the biggest thing that the FARC had to do was turn in their weapons and disarm. And I guess when you think about the FARC as sort of, a political party, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but they had been fighting for years, right? And in giving up their weapons, they really consented to give up their power to challenge the government. And I think that that's a really huge compromise. In terms of other small details, of course, one really big thing is that they agreed to follow the rules and the suggestions of the various transitional justice institutions, obviously, which are still going. The HEP, which is in charge of trials, is still running through and collecting data, and the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, should publish a report soon. But for example, all of the FARC's 10 members of Congress, they had to agree to any punishment handed down by the HEP, including giving up their seats in Congress, just like members of the government did. Mateo, do you want to add to that?
I think the other important thing is that most of the people from the FARC needed to leave some of the places where they were initially to just go to certain of these PDET areas, right? So instead of being all around the country where they actually were, they need to be concentrated in certain places. And that was intended for two things. One, to have everyone in the same place so they can provide some sort of security. And the other one is just to help with the provision of certain of the policies that the government wanted to do in terms of registration, putting some of these individuals into the actual system. There's a lot of these individuals didn't even have a document or a cédula de ciudadanía, that is like a national ID. So one of those things where these geographical concentrations were used in some cases just to make these processes a little bit faster when they were. But I think other than that, Gabby said most of the things, or the important things in terms of that.
Great, and I think there is also a number of questions about, of course, political participation is the second point in the agreement, right? And political participation by whom? Of course, by the FARC, that is the other part sitting on the table, right? This political participation allowed FARC members to be for 3 cycles, if I'm not wrong, 3, right? Cycles in the Congress with a number of seats that are reserved for them, while they constitute a political party, right, in the process of reintegration. Then this is one of the major points on the agreement that has been contested and has been, somehow taken wrong by a sector of the Colombian populace. Because you have these people now participating politically. It's very interesting if you can comment a little bit of how they did perform, the political party of the FARC in this last election of 2 weeks ago. Will be interesting if you have some numbers or something that could illuminate this issue of political participation.
I haven't actually seen how the Comunes did, particularly in these elections. I do know that they went and did some political alliances in certain places just to get into just to get into certain places. The thing though is that I think in terms of political participation, something that shows how they performed in these ones is related to how they did in the local elections in 2020. And it's just 2020 was the first time they actually participated in elections. They have a lot of people and a lot of candidates in different places that they thought they could win. However, the big electoral results is that they didn't do that well. I think if I remember correctly, they only get 1 or 2 mayor's offices when they have way more candidates. So I do feel that there's something to learn from that, in the sense that maybe in the places that they were providing these candidates were not the places where they could have some sort of electoral strongholds. And I think given that they didn't do that well in those elections, that these ones have, again, it's a higher level of government where like their support might be a little bit more diffuse, it's going to be harder. The other thing, though, is that because they already have these seats in Congress for the past elections, for the past 4 years and the next 4, then I don't think they have a lot of incentives to do anything else other than look for alliances in certain places. The interesting thing will be to measure them at the national level is going to be the next elections when these seats stop being transitory and they actually have to compete to have a seat in Congress. So I do feel that that's something that I do feel that the Farc, that the Comunes Party is actually looking at right now and trying to figure some sort of like strategies to keep being in Congress in the next 4 years. I do feel that in order to see how they might perform, then the next local elections are going to be key to actually understand A, if they learned for what it happened 4 years ago, and B, how well they can do and how they should at least politically align themselves in order to get into Congress once these transitory seats are not there anymore.
Yeah, please
sorry, go ahead. I'll just echo everything that Mateo said, but just because you asked for numbers, in the mid-March elections, they only got 50,000 votes across all of Colombia, and they didn't pick up any congressional seats beyond their guaranteed ones. But sort of like Mateo was saying, like it's not necessarily clear what that means because they haven't really run that much. I think another really important thing to point out is that I think it's entirely possible that people are really scared to vote for Comunes, given back in the 80s and 90s, the Farc had another political party, the UP, and all of its politicians were systematically assassinated. And as well as people who voted for the party, the areas in which they were living were targeted, as has been pretty extensively documented by someone named Abby Steele. So between sort of the guaranteed seats and between sort of the fear of voting, especially given all of the assassinations of social leaders, it's hard necessarily to know how to interpret the electoral results for Comunes recently.
Yeah, this is I think very clear that part of the agreement is to allow political participation in free and open elections, and also allow the possibility of for the Farc to constitute a political party, which means a lot of work and a lot of money that will have to happen. But yeah, it's interesting to see the discourses in the country with respect to that, and with respect to what another aspect that you were also bringing, that is the special curules, the special seats for victims, right? That now have become also, in a sense, they are also part of point 2 of the agreement. It's political participation, and also connected to another of the most important points, that is the issue of victims, right? That this accord brought at the center, right? How to bring the voice of the victims from every of the agents in conflict to the fore, and to allow also political participation of those victims. And by recognizing the distribution of violence in the territory, because the territory is clearly not covered by an internal conflict, but there are very specific spaces within the country in which this thing happened. And this recognition to create this special seats for victims goes precisely to those specific locations in the country to allow for a particular running with much less stringent numbers. Actually, you could it was an open process, right? To get elected into one of these appointments for la Cámara de Representantes, the second level court, Senate. And now we have results there. That is also interesting. Something interesting about this issue of the victim spaces is that actually was created by a legislative act in 2021, and that's connected to what Mateo was saying in terms of slowing the process of the peace accords. The peace accords were signed in 2016. This legislative act that allow for this victim spaces in Congress to run into Congress came just in 2021. Then also allowing very short periods of time for political organization or for the cooption by political forces within these territories to get more representation in the legislative. And what we are seeing is precisely that. A number of the seats have been taken by political cronies or by people with political power or with connections to violent power, and very few for victims. And if any comment on that, that would be interesting too.
Miguel, we also have two people that are raising their hands. I don't know, we should take some questions and then answer them simultaneously as well.
Yes, please. You can open your camera. And Nicolas, great to have you here, Nicolas.
No, you're muted.
Okay, now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. First, thank you so much for taking the time. As a Colombian student here at Duke, it's really valuable to see these kind of spaces. I just wanted to ask something regarding the future of the agreement, because, with the political scenario that we have right now, I don't really see like any candidate explicitly stating of turning the agreement back, but I don't really see them like really proposing or proposing enhancements to the agreement, like at least in the in any term, like both in the long run and the short run. So I just wanted to ask, because you pointed out something pretty interesting, that although they don't like disagree, they don't really like are trying to enforce the agreement to be fully implemented. So what do you think is going to be like the future of the agreement? Is just going to stay like this, slow implementation, or is there any way to change this?
So Mateo and I might have different answers to this because it's hypothetical. So I think one important thing is, and Paula pointed this out in the chat, is that like the peace accord has not been crucial in current political campaigns, which I find super concerning. That it just like the statements I found, like I had to search for them. They weren't like the prominent things that came up when you think about candidates' policies and profiles. And I think that that's an issue. What I would want is not necessarily the peace accord to change. I just want it to be implemented. I just want it to actually like follow through on all of the stipulations. There's the Crook Institute out of Notre Dame is charged with basically tracking the implementation of the peace accords, and it's illuminating to see how few of them have actually been implemented. I think if we continue the way that we're going, I can easily see a situation where the demobilized Farc gives up and rearms, or the government doesn't, especially if the government continues to not protect ex-combatants. And I think that would be like the complete dissolution of the peace accord, and would also be really dangerous for sort of nascent negotiations with the ELN. So that wasn't really an answer as to what is going to happen, but that is what I would like to happen, would be implementation.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with Gabby, and I think that like there are certain parts of the implementation that are very, very, very far along where they should be. When I was talking and doing my field work with like the ex-combatant focus groups, they were mentioning a lot that there was a lot of delay in terms of like the money that they should have been receiving, that the money is not enough, is not even like one minimum wage in Colombia. It's a little bit less depending on where you are. So that's not necessarily enough to live. They're doing these trainings in order to become more competitive in the labor market, but it's not really happening because no one wants to hire them. So I did have some conversations here where they were saying about, like, some of my friends took arms again, and they seem to be a lot better than I am. I'm committed to peace and I'm going to stay here. But, it's hard to see that how these other people that are doing the things that I don't want to do anymore are actually doing better. So I do feel that there should be a very strong and clear strategy on how to keep up with the things that were accorded. And definitely there are some things that will take more time. Those are all the points on rural development that's going to be harder to implement. But at least some of the things that should be done, they should be done and should be done correctly. I remember in the movie that we saw like a couple of weeks ago, one of these families that were trying to substitute coca production with avocado production, they got, I think, 8 avocado trees, very young avocado trees that, and like for some of you that know a little bit of avocados, they take a very long time to appear. So these small, palos or whatever, they're not going to give any fruit in the next like 2 or 3 years, maybe. So what would these families do when the main source of income in their family is not there anymore, right? And because they have signed certain things that they can produce again, then it puts them in a more precarious position that is very hard, that it could be enough, or it could ignite enough, or like be sufficient enough to just make people say, I tried this thing, it's not working. They're killing the people who are representing us. And these could easily backslide, I do feel, unless something else is done.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Reni Rueda, please, could you open your mic and your camera? And also I'll be reading a question just to have you in the back. This is from Paulo Sarmiento. To what extent the implementation of the peace agreement is playing an important role in the ongoing debate pre-elections? I feel that this topic is currently not crucial in the debate. And please, Reni Rueda.
Okay, first, I really appreciate the effort of Gabriella and Santiago to work on this topic. I think this is a very, very complex topic and deals with a lot of perspectives, from a security perspective to an entirely political and just politically context-oriented perspective here in Colombia. My question is, to which extent should the public really try to go on with the so-called peace agreement, in my perspective, as far as the number of the amount of coca crops in Colombia have increased dramatically after the so-called peace agreement. Currently, we are exporting something like 1,200 metric tons of cocaine, and much more, I believe, really. And it looks like over the last 2 to 3 years, many narcotraffic organizations, either with ties with Farc or with so-called backroom groups here in the territory, keep just moving on with these illegal activities, and of course are just pushing forward in the future to another security crisis in the country. So to which extent we should really, as experts or people who are working on the issue of political science and security, endorse to political events like the so-called peace agreements or these kinds of solutions? And thank you very much for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, Reni Rueda. I think let's refrain a little bit. I think in point 4 of the peace agreement is the solution to the illicit crops, right, to narco trafficking. And this is connected to this idea, notion and reality that for the Farc, participation in narco trafficking was fundamental for maintaining their armies across the territory, and they benefited from narco trafficking. And part of the agreement is trying to solve this problem of illicit crops. during this series, we try to, as Mateo was saying, bring a little bit of that dimension. That is a dimension that is not only a Colombian dimension, because the issue of narco trafficking is not a problem of Colombia per se. Colombia produces and exports illicit drugs, cocaine mostly, but it's part of a larger market and cannot solve the problem by itself. We just show a little snippet of what happens with what is called the cocaleros, of coca farmers in certain regions of the country, in particular in the Cauca region, in the south part of the country, while they are waiting of the implementation of the peace agreement that tries to bring other possibilities of rural development. And of course, this issue of the 4th point of the agreement, solution of the problem of illicit crops, is connected to the number one, the most important of the points in the agreement, that is an integral rural reform, right? The problem of land distribution, land tenure, land in particular in Colombia is central for the conflict historically, and these two go hand to hand. And just to bring you, I just was teaching my class 3 weeks ago, probably, and we were talking about this. Colombia initiated in 2011 with a law, a process of redistribution of land to those that had been displaced by violence. It has a bank of 5 million hectares of land, productive land, to be distributed to these people, right? It's a national list, registry of victims. And after 11 years, up to December 2021, only 400,000 hectares had been distributed, and less than 10%. That means that at the rate of redistribution of the lands that are part of that bank of land, the country will need 50 years to reach some sort of advancement on the number one of the points of the problem, that is land redistribution and agrarian reform. Then, yes, it's a complex issue. Just wanted to bring these two issues. Gabriella, Mateo, you want to?
Yeah. So as for whether we should be continuing to be supporting the peace accord, that's a question that I think whether anyone should support any policy on a personal level is different than sort of as academics. The way that I think about it as a political scientist is what is a counterfactual. So where would we be if the peace accord didn't exist at all? And then where would we be if the peace accord had been fully implemented, right? And I think from what I can tell, as someone who studies the region, I think that there would be a lot more violence and a lot more death if the peace accord hadn't happened. And I think as for things like growing exportation of drugs, I think that those numbers would be lower if rural development plans were actually being implemented, as opposed to sort of like phosphates being flown from the sky. Right. So I think I personally am very much in support of the peace accord and of trying to strengthen it. But, over 50% of Colombians didn't vote for it. Right. So it's not that is a given. Right. And there are lots of people who would disagree with me on that.
Yeah, I think I'm very much in the same headspace as Gabby. I do feel that the only way to move forward is to continue with the peace accords. I do feel that we have way more things to lose if we don't follow it through than if we just do the extra effort to just do the commitments that we had as a Colombian society. And I do feel that this is not only, at least in the field work that I've done, this is not only something that is coming from the government, to put it into some abstract scale. But when you go and talk to the day-to-day person or day-to-day conversations, there's a lot of things that you should do, right? Like when I was talking with these ex-combatants about how they feel, and it's just certain small things that they feel discriminated against, they have to go, once people in their town, they know about the reincorporation process, they start treating them differently. When they start businesses, some people just like stop going to their businesses, and then all the money that invested in them, then they need to sell them. And these like are really huge things that are not necessarily tied to like the big government things that the government needs to do, right? So I do feel that given the results from the plebiscite and the fact that, you know, a lot of Colombians are not necessarily 100% into the agreement, I do feel that there are certain things that could be done both at the government and at like the public opinion level that could help with this a little bit more. How to do it is hard. The current polarization for the elections, I don't think is necessarily helping in this regard, and we see that, as Gabby was mentioning, we don't see people talking about this, and I don't think we should have it as a given. These is still like, you know, if you go back into like the literature of like peace processes and everything, you know, we're still not in a stable peace. These accords can become like can disappear at any moment if we decide not to do things about it. And I do feel that, you know, if the conditions that are happening that are present in our country right now could go either way, but it needs a push into the right direction.
Yes, and then we have one last question and last comment from Angela Duran. She says, I don't know to what extent this is happening already, but I think the U.S. support, apart from financial, could be provided for implementation, surveillance, education, and job opportunities for ex-combatants, competitiveness, and tech projects, etc. Thank you, Angela. Actually, tomorrow we'll have the visit of Juan Carlos Pinzón, the Colombian ambassador to the United States. He's going to be talking about 200 years of diplomatic relationships between the U.S. and Colombia, and the opportunities and challenges of this partnership. Let's say the U.S. Fully supports the agreement and has backed up most of the aspects of it. Of course, it's critical about some aspects of it too. But if you want to make that question tomorrow to Ambassador Pinzón, will be fantastic. We invite you all to do that. And Paula Sarmiento had last word. You have a question you want to make? Paula, you want to open your mic and your camera if you want? We have a couple of minutes. She has her raised.
Well, Paula figures the camera on. I just wanted to make a comment regarding sort of like what the U.S. could do, and I do feel that was sort of like the first. That was so all the things that we were talking to you about. We put this into a Washington Post article that we wrote with Gabi and Juan. And one of the things that we thought or we took advantage of is the fact that for the U.S. the Farc is not anymore part of like the terrorist groups. And I do feel that's important because now some of the money that the US could give to support to the peace process can actually go into helping Farc members to do certain things. Before that, it was impossible, and then they needed to go through different organizations, the IOM, the UN, and make things a little bit more difficult in order to get this money into there. So we do believe, and that was like one of our like first stands when we started writing this, was this idea of, you know, these could change things and could give a push in the right direction.
Paula.
Everybody, so related to what Mateo was saying, I kind of like not think that even if the accord is not implemented, it would be too difficult for the Farc, specifically this group, to rearm, but other different groups could strengthen. So what I think it could happen if the peace agreements are not implemented is that the violence may continue to rise. And therefore, I don't know if we should expect an increase in the security budget allocation of the national government as a response. as a response to this. So it's more like a question, or maybe you do think that the Farc could rearm. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. Violence in Colombia and this conflict was an existential threat for the sustainability of the nation. The nation created or allocated many funds at the beginning of the century to confront violence through a couple of presidential periods that reach a point of not sustainability. Then actually the peace agreement came in a moment in which military defeat was on the horizon for the Farc, but as in a guerrilla style war, there is not military defeat, right? It's just, that's impossible, right, in a conventional way. And the sustainability of the army was impossible to hold. And because the Colombia is facing, also systematic problems in its economic output, and the future output is also on the table, then I don't think that there's going to be lots of money to put into security if the country really don't find the right path of sustainable development that the peace agreement would somehow allow things to happen. But that's a large conversation that we could have on that front. But any final remarks, Gabi, Mateo? Thank you so much.
I think just in turn, well, first, thank you everyone for staying and listening to us and for you guys to invite us. I just wanted to give sort of like a quick response to Paula's comment, and it's like, I do believe there is still a possibility. It will be harder, but if people want just to go back, I think we are at a point that it could happen. Would it be the same group as it was before? No. And how would this result in the hypothetical scenario that this happens, how the Farc will look? Probably is going to be very different. But I do feel that the threat is still there, because I do feel that there's not been enough progress, and I feel that we're still so behind in certain things and like up to speed in others that they need to match at some point.
Yeah, I guess I'll give a final thought. Obviously, thank you all so much for being here and listening. I think one key takeaway that I want to emphasize is that like the Colombian Peace Accord still matters and effort still needs to be put into it. It is not sort of a stable given and we can just, move on with politics as usual. But this is something that we still need to be caring about and thinking about and trying to support.
With that, thank you so much. Kevin.
Oh, right. Well, in closing, thank you guys. Thank you, Gabrielle, Mateo, and also our Professor Sotelo, and thank you all the attendees who've joined us today. Wednesdays at the Center will continue again next week, March 30th, on this very informative topic, Colombia 5 Years of Peace series. Also, next week's title on embodied enactments, human rights in Colombian literature and cultural production. Book presentation with editors Kevin Guerreri from the University of California, San Diego, and Carlos Gadera Zabal Bravo from the Rhodes College. Authors Daniel Corral from the University of California, Davis, Carolina Sanchez, Rutgers University, and also again, our own Duke University's Miguel Rojas-Sotelo. So thank you again. Hope to see you all next week, March 30th, Wednesdays at the Center. Have a great day.